The release of Morrison's complete evidence files on Christmas Eve 2019 triggered a cascade of events that would reshape British politics and society for years to come. Within hours of the international publication, governments around the world were demanding explanations from British authorities, and Interpol issued arrest warrants for 12 individuals named in Morrison's documentation. Morrison watched the initial response from a safe house arranged by an international human rights organization. For the first time in weeks, he felt a cautious optimism that justice might actually prevail. The evidence was too comprehensive and too widely distributed to be suppressed or discredited. But Morrison also knew that his own survival was far from guaranteed. The people he had exposed had already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their secrets, and Morrison was now the most dangerous threat they faced. On December 27th, Morrison's fears proved justified when an assassination attempt was made against him at the safe house. Only the vigilance of his protection detail and his own military training saved his life. The attack was sophisticated and professional, confirming that his enemies had access to resources far beyond ordinary criminal organizations. Morrison realized he could not remain in Britain safely. Working with his international contacts, he arranged to relocate to a country where he could continue his advocacy for the victims while remaining beyond the reach of those who wanted him silenced. Meanwhile, the political consequences of Morrison's revelations were unfolding rapidly. The Prime Minister was forced to establish a special commission to investigate the allegations, headed by retired judges and international observers to ensure independence. Parliament called emergency sessions to address the crisis of confidence in British institutions. Most significantly, victims began coming forward in unprecedented numbers. Morrison's courage in exposing the truth had given other survivors the strength to tell their stories. Within a month of his final evidence release, more than 40 young people had provided testimony about their experiences in the abuse network. The survivors' stories painted an even more horrific picture than Morrison's original evidence had suggested. The network had been operating for at least a decade, involving hundreds of victims and dozens of perpetrators. The abuse had taken place at multiple locations, including private estates, government buildings, and even on royal properties beyond Windsor Castle. Sarah Chun, who had been released after international pressure following her arrest, continued her investigation from exile. Her reporting revealed that the cover-up had cost the lives of at least 12 people who had threatened to expose the network over the years. Emma Richardson had not been the first victim to be murdered for trying to seek justice. On January 15, 2020, the first arrest warrants were issued. Lord Mountbatten Windsor was detained at a private airport while attempting to flee to a country without extradition treaties. 3 senior police officials, including Detective Chief Inspector Wessex, were arrested in coordinated raids across Europe. Prince Andrew remained beyond reach, reportedly hiding in a Gulf state that refused to cooperate with British authorities. But the evidence against him was so overwhelming that his royal titles were formally stripped, and he was disowned by the royal family in a desperate attempt to preserve the monarchy itself. The trials that followed would expose the full scope of the conspiracy. Over 18 months of court proceedings, prosecutors presented evidence that the abuse network had generated millions of pounds in profits through various schemes, including blackmail of prominent individuals who had been secretly recorded participating in illegal activities. Morrison testified via secure video link from his exile location, his identity protected but his evidence crucial to securing convictions. His testimony was powerful and detailed, walking the court through every aspect of his investigation and the evidence he had gathered. The survivors who testified showed incredible courage in facing their abusers in court. Their testimonies were heartbreaking but also inspiring, demonstrating the resilience of young people who had survived horrific trauma and found the strength to demand justice. The verdicts, when they came, were largely favorable to the prosecution. Lord Mountbatten Windsor was sentenced to 25 years in prison for multiple counts of sexual abuse of minors. Detective Chief Inspector Wessex received 15 years for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Dozens of other defendants received sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years. But Morrison knew that many of the most powerful perpetrators had escaped justice. Several individuals named in his evidence had fled the country before warrants could be issued. Others had died under suspicious circumstances before they could be prosecuted. The network had been disrupted, but not entirely destroyed. More troubling was the evidence that similar networks existed in other countries. Morrison's revelations had sparked investigations in France, Germany, and the United States, uncovering related abuse operations involving powerful individuals in those nations as well. Morrison realized that his fight against institutional abuse was far from over. Working with survivor advocacy organizations and international law enforcement agencies, he established a foundation dedicated to identifying and exposing abuse networks around the world. The foundation, which operated from multiple countries to avoid suppression by any single government, developed innovative techniques for investigating organized abuse. They created secure communication channels for survivors to report their experiences safely, established witness protection programs for those willing to testify, and worked to identify patterns that might reveal previously unknown abuse operations. Morrison's transformation from Royal Guard to international advocate for abuse survivors was complete. He had given up his career, his home, and his safety to pursue justice for young people he had never known. But he had also discovered a purpose more meaningful than anything he had experienced in his previous life. The impact of Morrison's courage extended far beyond the specific prosecutions that resulted from his evidence. His willingness to expose powerful criminals regardless of their status inspired other whistleblowers around the world to come forward with evidence of institutional corruption and abuse. Educational institutions, religious organizations, sports programs, and entertainment companies all faced increased scrutiny as survivors found their voices and demanded accountability. The culture of silence and intimidation that had protected abusers for generations began to crumble. Morrison also played a crucial role in establishing new legal protections for whistleblowers and abuse survivors. Working with human rights organizations and sympathetic legislators, he helped draft legislation that provided better protection for people who exposed institutional crimes and more comprehensive support for victims seeking justice. 5 years after his initial discovery in the basement of Windsor Castle, Morrison looked back on the journey that had transformed his life. The personal cost had been enormous. He could never return to Britain safely. He had lost his career and his normal life, and he would always live with the knowledge that powerful enemies wanted him dead. But Morrison also knew that his actions had saved lives and prevented countless future victims from suffering abuse. The network he had exposed was gone. Its perpetrators were in prison or exile, and survivors had received both justice and the support they needed to rebuild their lives. Emma Richardson's death would always haunt Morrison, but he had ensured that her sacrifice was not in vain. The foundation established in her memory had helped hundreds of other young people escape abuse and find safety. Most importantly, Morrison had proven that ordinary people could hold even the most powerful institutions accountable when they had the courage to act on their principles. His example had inspired others to speak truth to power, creating a ripple effect that continued to spread years after his initial brave decision to investigate those disturbing sounds in the night. The basement of Windsor Castle remained sealed, but it was no longer a place where powerful people could commit crimes with impunity. Morrison had turned it from a chamber of secrets into evidence of the truth that could never be buried completely. As he continued his work advocating for abuse survivors around the world, Morrison carried with him the knowledge that his 15-year career protecting the royal family had ultimately led to its most important mission, protecting the innocent from those who would prey upon them. The young voices that had cried out in that basement had been heard, their suffering had been acknowledged, and their abusers had faced justice. It was not a complete victory. Such victories rarely are in battles against institutional corruption. But it was enough to prove that truth, courage, and persistence could still triumph over power, privilege, and conspiracy. Morrison's story became a testament to the principle that every person has the responsibility to act when they witness injustice, regardless of the personal cost. His legacy was not just the criminals he had exposed or the survivors he had helped, but the example he had set for others who might one day face their own moment of moral choice. In the end, Morrison had discovered that the highest form of service to any institution is the willingness to hold it accountable to its own stated values. By exposing the crimes committed within the walls of Windsor Castle, he had ultimately served the true principles of justice and protection that the royal family claimed to represent. The screams that had disturbed his patrol that November night in 2019 had led Morrison on a journey that changed not just his own life, but the lives of countless others who would benefit from his courage to listen, investigate, and act when action was needed most. The response to Morrison's complaint was swift and brutal. The man who had always been a mentor and ally now looked uncomfortable and avoided direct eye contact. "James," Davies began, his voice strained, "I've been instructed to inform you that your security clearance has been temporarily revoked. You're being placed on administrative leave while certain allegations are investigated." "What allegations?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "There are concerns that you may have been accessing unauthorized areas of the castle, tampering with security equipment, and making false reports. There are also questions about your psychological fitness for duty." Morrison felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice controlled. "Inspector, you know me better than anyone. You know these allegations are fabricated to discredit my complaint." Davies finally looked directly at Morrison, and, for a moment, his professional mask slipped. "James, I need you to understand something. The people you're dealing with have resources and connections that go far beyond anything you or I can imagine. They can destroy your career, your reputation, even your life. If you were to quietly withdraw your complaint and accept early retirement with full benefits, this could all go away." "And the victims?" Morrison asked. "What happens to them?" Davies looked away again. "That's not your responsibility anymore." Morrison stood up from his chair. "With respect, Inspector, that's exactly my responsibility. It's every decent person's responsibility." As Morrison left Davies' office, he knew he was truly on his own within the system. But he also knew that his preparation over the past weeks was about to be tested. The first sign that his strategy was working came that evening. Sarah Chun, an investigative journalist with The Guardian who had received one of Morrison's evidence packages, called his personal phone. "Captain Morrison, I've reviewed your materials, and I have to say, this is the most significant story I've encountered in 15 years of journalism. But I need to verify some details before we can move forward with publication." Over the next week, Morrison worked closely with Chun and her team to authenticate his evidence. The Guardian brought in digital forensics experts to verify that the video and audio recordings had not been tampered with. They contacted victim advocacy organizations to independently confirm Emma Richardson's story. They researched the backgrounds of the individuals Morrison had identified to establish their connections to each other and to previous allegations of impropriety. Meanwhile, the campaign to discredit Morrison intensified. Stories appeared in tabloid newspapers describing him as a disgruntled ex-employee who had been struggling with mental health issues. Anonymous sources claimed that Morrison had a history of making false accusations and that his military service had ended under questionable circumstances. Morrison knew that these stories were fabricated, but he also knew that they would be believed by many people. The character assassination was professional and comprehensive, clearly designed by people who had experience in managing public relations crises. More seriously, Morrison began to notice surveillance around his apartment. Cars that didn't belong in the neighborhood appeared regularly on his street. His phone calls seemed to have unusual delays and echo effects that suggested they were being monitored. His email accounts experienced repeated hacking attempts. On December 10th, Morrison's world changed dramatically when Emma Richardson was found dead in her London apartment. The official cause of death was listed as a drug overdose, but Morrison knew immediately that Emma had been murdered. The young woman had been clean for months and was preparing to give formal testimony to support Morrison's allegations. Her death was far too convenient to be coincidental. Morrison felt overwhelming grief for a young woman whose only crime had been trusting him to protect her. But he also felt a burning rage that strengthened his resolve to see this through to the end. Emma's death proved that the people he was fighting against would kill to protect their secrets. Sarah Chun called Morrison the day after Emma's death. "Captain, I need you to know that my editors are getting pressure from very high levels to kill this story. But Emma Richardson's death changes everything. We're moving forward with publication, but I need you to be prepared for what's coming. What do you mean? Morrison asked. These people have already killed to protect themselves, Chen replied. Your life is in serious danger. You need to take precautions. Morrison had already been taking precautions, but Emma's death made him realize they weren't enough. He moved out of his apartment and stayed in different hotels each night, paying with cash and avoiding any predictable patterns. He varied his routes and schedules randomly. He shared his location with trusted contacts at specific intervals so that his disappearance would be noticed quickly. On December 15th, The Guardian published the first installment of what would become known as the Windsor Papers, a comprehensive expose of the abuse network Morrison had uncovered. The story included Morrison's video evidence, testimony from multiple victims who had come forward after Emma's story became public, and detailed documentation of the cover-up attempts. The public response was immediate and explosive. Protesters gathered outside Buckingham Palace demanding answers. Members of Parliament called for emergency sessions to address the allegations. International media picked up the story, making it impossible for British authorities to contain the scandal domestically. But the establishment response was equally swift. Within hours of the story's publication, the Metropolitan Police announced that they were investigating The Guardian for publishing falsified evidence and libeling members of the royal family. The newspaper's offices were raided, and Sarah Chun was arrested on charges of criminal conspiracy. Morrison realized that his enemies were willing to destroy press freedom itself to protect their secrets. But he also realized that the international attention meant his evidence was now beyond their ability to suppress completely. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Detective Sergeant Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police who specialized in child protection, contacted Morrison through an encrypted communication channel. Captain Morrison, her message read, I've been investigating missing children cases for 2 decades, and your evidence explains patterns I've been seeing for years. I have files on dozens of young people who disappeared from care homes and shelters, only to turn up months later with stories about special programs they couldn't talk about. I want to help you, but I need protection for my family. Santos brought Morrison into contact with a network of law enforcement officers, social workers, and civil servants who had been quietly documenting evidence of the abuse network for years. They had been afraid to act individually, but Morrison's public exposure gave them the cover they needed to come forward collectively. Over the next week, a flood of corroborating evidence emerged. Care home administrators reported suspicious recruitment activities they had been pressured not to investigate. Social workers described cases where children had been removed from their supervision through official channels, only to disappear entirely. Police officers revealed that certain investigations had been shut down from above without explanation. The evidence painted a picture of systematic corruption that extended throughout multiple levels of government, law enforcement, and social services. The abuse network hadn't survived for years despite the vigilance of authorities. It had survived because of corruption within those same authorities. On December 22nd, the pressure became so intense that Buckingham Palace issued an unprecedented statement acknowledging that serious allegations were being investigated and that any individuals found to have engaged in criminal activity will face the full force of the law, regardless of their position or status. But Morrison knew that public statements were different from actual accountability. Prince Andrew and Lord Mountbatten Windsor had both disappeared from public view, reportedly traveling abroad for medical treatment and family obligations. Detective Chief Inspector Wessex had submitted his resignation and moved to a country without an extradition treaty with the United Kingdom. The people with the most evidence against them were escaping justice, while lower-level enablers were being sacrificed to protect the most powerful perpetrators. Morrison made a decision that he knew might cost him his life, but was the only way to ensure real justice. He had been holding back his most damning evidence, recordings that implicated members of the government, the judiciary, and the security services in covering up the abuse network. He had hoped that the initial revelations would be enough to trigger legitimate investigations that would uncover this additional corruption naturally. But it had become clear that the system was too corrupt to investigate itself. If the full truth was going to come out, Morrison would have to release everything, regardless of the consequences. On Christmas Eve, 2019, Morrison arranged for the simultaneous release of his complete evidence files to journalists in 12 different countries, along with copies to human rights organizations, parliamentary oversight committees, and international law enforcement agencies. The final evidence dump revealed that the abuse network had been operating with the knowledge and protection of sitting government ministers, senior judges, and high-ranking police officials. It showed that previous investigations had been deliberately sabotaged, witnesses had been intimidated or killed, and evidence had been systematically destroyed. Morrison knew that releasing this evidence would make him the most wanted man in Britain, not by law enforcement seeking justice, but by powerful criminals seeking to silence him permanently. But he also knew it was the only way to honor Emma Richardson's memory and ensure that other young victims would have a chance at justice. As he prepared for what might be the final phase of his fight for truth, Morrison reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. A simple investigation of suspicious sounds had uncovered one of the most extensive criminal conspiracies in British history. But, more importantly, it had tested his character and proven that ordinary people could still hold the powerful accountable, even at enormous personal cost. The battle for justice was far from over, but Morrison had ensured that the truth could never be completely buried again. Whatever happened to him, the evidence would survive, and the victims would have a voice that could not be silenced. Morrison sat in his private apartment at 3 a.m., staring at the digital camera display with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The 90 minutes of footage he had captured told a story that was worse than anything he had imagined. The evidence was clear, disturbing, and absolutely damning. The video showed Prince Andrew and Lord Mountbatten Windsor with 4 young people who appeared to be between the ages of 15 and 18. The activities Morrison had documented were unquestionably criminal: sexual abuse of minors, physical intimidation, and what appeared to be drug administration to keep the victims compliant. But more disturbing than the crimes themselves was the casual nature with which they were being committed, suggesting this was a well-established pattern rather than an isolated incident. Morrison had also captured audio of conversations that revealed the scope of what was happening. The basement rooms weren't just being used occasionally. They were part of a regular operation that had been ongoing for years. References were made to bringing in fresh ones, to the usual arrangements, and to keeping them quiet until they age out. Most chilling of all was a conversation Morrison had overheard about previous victims who had become problems. The discussion included references to payoffs, threats, and, in at least 2 cases, what sounded like more permanent solutions to young people who had threatened to go public with their experiences. Morrison realized he wasn't just documenting ongoing abuse. He was uncovering evidence of a systematic cover-up that likely included murder. As he reviewed the footage for the 3rd time, Morrison noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the background of several shots, he could see other individuals who appeared to be keeping watch or assisting with the activities. One of them looked familiar, and when Morrison enhanced the image using his camera's zoom function, he identified the figure as Detective Chief Inspector Harold Wessex of the Metropolitan Police, one of the officers responsible for royal family security liaison. The corruption wasn't limited to the royal family. It extended into law enforcement, which meant that reporting through normal police channels would likely result in Morrison's evidence being suppressed and possibly his own life being threatened. Morrison spent the remainder of the night researching his options. He needed to find a way to expose the evidence that couldn't be blocked by corrupt officials within the system. After extensive research, he identified several possibilities: investigative journalists known for their integrity and willingness to take on powerful figures, international human rights organizations that could publicize the evidence globally, and parliamentary oversight committees that operated independently of royal influence. But Morrison also knew that simply releasing the evidence publicly might not be enough to ensure justice for the victims. The young people he had seen were still in immediate danger, and Morrison's military training told him that their safety had to be his first priority. Over the next 3 days, Morrison conducted careful surveillance of the East Wing basement. He established a pattern of the activities. The basement was being used 3 nights per week, typically Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, from approximately midnight until 3 a.m. The same young people appeared repeatedly, but Morrison also documented evidence that new victims were being brought in regularly. On Thursday night, Morrison made a decision that would put his own life at risk but might save the lives of the victims. Instead of simply observing and documenting, he would intervene directly. Morrison waited until the activities in the basement were well underway, then activated the fire alarm system for the East Wing. The alarm would require immediate evacuation of the area and bring fire department personnel to the scene, making it impossible for the activities to continue and ensuring that the victims would be removed from immediate danger. As the fire alarm blared throughout the East Wing, Morrison positioned himself where he could observe the basement entrance while appearing to respond to the emergency. Within minutes, he saw several figures emerge from the archive storage room, moving quickly and obviously trying to avoid being seen. Prince Andrew and Lord Mountbatten Windsor were among the first to exit, looking panicked and disheveled. They were followed by Detective Chief Inspector Wessex and another man Morrison didn't recognize. Finally, the young people emerged, escorted by additional adults who seemed to be serving as handlers. The fire department arrived within 10 minutes, followed closely by additional security personnel. During the confusion of the emergency response, Morrison was able to approach one of the young victims, a girl who appeared to be about 16 years old and was clearly in shock. "Are you all right?" Morrison asked quietly, positioning himself between the girl and the adults who had been escorting her. The girl looked up at him with eyes that held more pain and fear than anyone her age should ever experience. "Please," she whispered. "They said they would hurt my family if I told anyone. But I can't. I can't keep doing this." Morrison felt his heart break as he looked at this young person who had been systematically victimized by people who were supposed to represent the highest values of British society. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Emma," she replied. "Emma Richardson. I'm from Manchester. They took me from a care home 6 months ago, said they had a special opportunity for me. But it wasn't what they said it would be." Morrison quickly wrote down his personal phone number on a piece of paper and slipped it to Emma. "If you can get away safely, call me. I'm going to help you, but I need you to be careful. Don't let them know we talked." Before Emma could respond, one of the handlers approached them. "Come on, love," the man said to Emma, but his tone was threatening rather than kind. "Time to go." Morrison watched helplessly as Emma was led away, but he had planted a seed that might save her life. He had also identified at least one victim who might be willing to testify about what was happening in the basement. The fire department completed their inspection and found no evidence of an actual fire, concluding that the alarm had been triggered by a malfunction in the aging electrical system. The area was cleared and normal operations resumed, but Morrison noticed that the basement activities did not resume that night. His intervention had disrupted the operation, at least temporarily. Over the next week, Morrison received 2 phone calls on his personal number. The first was from Emma Richardson, who had managed to escape from her handlers during a transport between locations. She had taken refuge with a friend in London and was terrified but safe. Morrison arranged to meet with her to document her testimony about the abuse she had suffered. The second call was much more ominous. The voice was disguised electronically, but the message was clear. "Stop investigating things that don't concern you, Captain Morrison. There are people with considerable resources who are watching your activities. It would be unfortunate if something were to happen to you or your family." Morrison had never married and had no children, but he did have an elderly mother living in Scotland and a sister with 2 young children in Wales. The threat was real and it was credible, but it also confirmed that his investigation was making the right people nervous. Morrison met with Emma Richardson at a safe location arranged through a contact he had made with a victim advocacy organization. Emma's testimony was heartbreaking, but also incredibly valuable. She described a systematic operation that had been running for at least 5 years, involving dozens of young people from care homes, runaway shelters, and economically disadvantaged families. According to Emma, the victims were recruited through what appeared to be legitimate employment or education opportunities. They were told they would be working at royal events, or participating in special programs for underprivileged youth, or receiving scholarships for exclusive schools. Once they were isolated from their support systems, they were gradually introduced to increasingly inappropriate activities. The operation was sophisticated and well-organized. Victims were housed in various locations around London, moved regularly to prevent them from forming support networks, and subjected to psychological manipulation designed to make them compliant and prevent them from seeking help. Those who resisted or threatened to expose the operation faced escalating consequences, from financial threats against their families to physical violence and, in some cases, permanent disappearance. Emma also provided Morrison with information about other victims who might be willing to testify. She knew of at least 6 young people who had been in the program for varying lengths of time, and she believed there were many others she had never met. Most importantly, Emma confirmed Morrison's suspicion that the operation extended far beyond Prince Andrew and Lord Mountbatten-Windsor. She described being abused by prominent businessmen, government officials, judges, and other members of the aristocracy. The basement at Windsor Castle was just one of several locations where the activities took place. Armed with Emma's testimony and his own video evidence, Morrison now faced the most difficult decision of his life. He had enough evidence to expose a massive criminal conspiracy involving some of the most powerful people in Britain. But he also knew that those same people had the resources to destroy him, silence the victims, and cover up the crimes if he moved too quickly or through the wrong channels. Morrison decided that his only chance of success was to prepare for every possible response before making his evidence public. He created multiple copies of all his documentation, storing them in various secure locations. He prepared detailed written testimony that could be released even if he was killed or disappeared. He established contact with journalists in multiple countries, ensuring that the story could break internationally even if it was suppressed in Britain. Most importantly, Morrison worked with victim advocacy organizations to ensure that Emma and other potential witnesses would have protection and support if they decided to come forward publicly. On November 30th, 2019, exactly 15 days after his initial discovery, Morrison submitted a formal complaint to the Independent Police Complaints Commission, accompanied by complete documentation of his evidence. He also simultaneously provided copies of his evidence to 3 investigative journalists, 2 human rights organizations, and a member of parliament who had a reputation for taking on powerful corruption. Morrison knew that filing the complaint would make him a target, but he also knew that it was the only way to ensure justice for the victims and prevent the abuse from continuing. As he walked out of the IPCC offices in London, Morrison felt a mixture of relief and terror. He had done the right thing, but he also knew that his life would never be the same. The response to Morrison's complaint would test everything he believed about justice, courage, and the possibility of holding even the most powerful people accountable for their crimes. But for the first time in weeks, Morrison felt like he could sleep peacefully, knowing that he had chosen to stand with the victims rather than protect the institution that had enabled their abuse. The battle for truth was just beginning, and Morrison would soon learn just how far powerful people would go to protect their secrets. But he had already won the most important victory. He had chosen to act when action was needed. Regardless of the personal cost, Morrison's hand trembled slightly as he closed the basement door and stepped back into the corridor with Williams. Both men stood in stunned silence for several moments, their tactical flashlights casting long shadows on the ancient stone walls. What they had witnessed through that crack in the door was so far beyond anything in their experience that neither knew how to process it. "Captain," Williams whispered, his voice barely audible, "what do we do now?" Morrison had been asking himself the same question since the moment he had seen those 2 familiar figures in the basement room. His 15 years of Royal Protection Service had trained him to handle many situations: terrorist threats, assassination attempts, unauthorized intrusions. But nothing had prepared him for this. The people he had seen in that room were not intruders or threats to the royal family. They were members of the royal family. The younger figure had been Prince Andrew, there was no doubt about it. Morrison had protected him on dozens of occasions and would recognize his profile anywhere. The older man had taken Morrison longer to identify, but when the figure had turned slightly, revealing his distinctive features, Morrison's stomach had dropped. It was Lord Mountbatten-Windsor, a cousin to the Queen who held a minor but official royal title and often appeared at state functions. But it wasn't their presence that had shocked Morrison. It was what they appeared to be doing, and with whom. The other figures in the room were young, far too young to be in any basement at Windsor Castle in the middle of the night. Morrison had seen at least 3 individuals who appeared to be teenagers, both male and female, in various states of undress and obvious distress. The scene had all the hallmarks of something that Morrison's police training had taught him to recognize, but his mind recoiled from accepting what his eyes had shown him. "We need to get back upstairs," Morrison said finally, making the hardest decision of his professional career. "We need to think about this carefully before we do anything." Williams nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. They made their way back through the basement corridor and up the narrow stone staircase, their footsteps seeming impossibly loud in the enclosed space. When they emerged into the archive storage room, they found Chun pacing nervously near the door. "Captain, thank God," Chun said, relief evident in his voice. "You've been down there for almost 30 minutes. I was about to call for backup." "Chun, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Morrison said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. "What we found down there is complicated. Before we proceed, we need to secure this area and make sure no one else accesses it." Over the next hour, Morrison's team worked to restore the archive storage room to its original condition, moving the filing cabinets back into place to conceal the basement entrance. Morrison knew they couldn't leave the area unsecured, but he also knew that calling for immediate backup could trigger a chain of events that might destroy innocent lives along with the guilty. Back in the security office, Morrison dismissed Chun and Williams for the remainder of their shift, instructing them to file routine patrol reports that made no mention of the basement discovery. He knew he was asking them to compromise their professional integrity, but he also knew he needed time to fully understand what they had witnessed before taking action. Alone in his office, Morrison spent the remainder of the night reviewing everything he knew about the basement areas of Windsor Castle. He pulled up architectural records, maintenance reports, and security protocols, trying to piece together how those rooms could have been accessed without triggering any security alerts. What he discovered disturbed him even more than the scene in the basement. According to the records, the basement areas had been sealed for structural concerns in 1978, but Morrison found references to renovation work that had been carried out in 1995, 17 years after the supposed sealing. The renovation had been authorized directly by the Palace Administrator's office, with no record of who had requested the work or what it had involved. More troubling still, Morrison found references in the security logs to private inspections of the East Wing basement areas that had taken place irregularly over the past 15 years. These inspections had been authorized by royal warrants that bypassed normal security protocols, and the individuals conducting them had been granted access without standard background checks. As dawn broke over Windsor Castle, Morrison realized he was facing the most serious situation of his career. The evidence suggested that certain members of the royal family had been using the forgotten basement areas for purposes that were, at best, highly inappropriate and, at worst, criminal. The young people he had seen in distress were not there voluntarily, and Morrison's training told him that what he had witnessed might be part of a pattern of abuse that had been ongoing for years. But Morrison also understood the implications of exposing such activities. The scandal would destroy the monarchy, devastate innocent family members who had no knowledge of the activities, and potentially destabilize the British government itself. The decision of whether to act on what he had discovered was one that would affect millions of people. Morrison's contemplation was interrupted by a knock on his office door. "Come in," he called, quickly closing the files he had been reviewing. The door opened to reveal Inspector Davies, the senior security administrator for Windsor Castle. Davies was a career civil servant who had worked in royal protection for over 25 years, and Morrison had always respected his judgment and integrity. "James," Davies said, settling into the chair across from Morrison's desk, "I've just reviewed the overnight reports. Very quiet night, according to your team." Morrison felt his pulse quicken. "Yes, sir. Routine patrols, no incidents to report." Davies studied Morrison's face carefully. "You look tired. Everything all right?" Morrison had worked with Davies long enough to know that the inspector had an uncanny ability to sense when something was wrong. It was one of the qualities that had made him so effective in his role, but It also made him dangerous to anyone trying to conceal information. Just a long night, Morrison replied, trying to keep his voice casual. You know how it is during the winter months. The castle feels different at night. Indeed it does, Davies agreed. James, I want to ask you about something that came to my attention this morning. Our maintenance staff reported that some of the filing cabinets in the East Wing archive storage room appear to have been moved recently. There are fresh scratch marks on the floor, and the dust patterns don't match what they remember from previous inspections. Morrison felt his mouth go dry, but he maintained his composure. I'm not sure what that could be about. My team didn't access that storage room during our patrol. Davies leaned forward slightly. James, in all the years we've worked together, I've come to trust your judgment completely. But I also know when you're keeping something from me. If there's something going on that I need to know about, now would be the time to tell me. For a moment, Morrison considered telling Davies everything. The inspector had always been a man of integrity, someone who put duty and truth above personal considerations. But Morrison also knew that Davies was a career civil servant whose first loyalty was to the institution of the monarchy. If Morrison revealed what he had discovered, he couldn't be certain how Davies would respond. Inspector, Morrison said carefully, if you were to discover evidence of criminal activity involving high-profile individuals, what would your protocol be? Davies raised an eyebrow at the hypothetical question. That would depend entirely on the nature of the criminal activity and the evidence involved. Why do you ask? Just curious about procedures, Morrison replied. In our line of work, we have to be prepared for unusual situations. Davies studied Morrison for a long moment before responding. James, if you have discovered something that you believe requires investigation, you have several options. You can report it through normal security channels, which would mean informing me and, ultimately, the palace administrator. You can request a meeting with the Metropolitan Police liaison, who handles royal protection matters. Or, if you believe the situation involves serious criminal activity that might be covered up through normal channels, you can contact the Independent Police Complaints Commission directly. The fact that Davies had mentioned the possibility of a cover-up through normal channels told Morrison that the inspector suspected something significant was wrong. It also gave him valuable information about his options for proceeding. Thank you, Inspector, Morrison said. That's helpful to know. Davies stood to leave, but paused at the door. James, whatever you might have discovered, I want you to know that I will support you if you decide to pursue the truth. The integrity of this institution depends on people like you being willing to do what's right, regardless of the consequences. After Davies left, Morrison sat alone in his office, weighing his options. He could report what he had seen through normal channels, but that would likely result in a cover-up that protected the guilty and silenced the victims. He could contact the Metropolitan Police directly, but he had no guarantee that corruption didn't extend into law enforcement as well. Or he could conduct his own investigation first, gathering more evidence before deciding how to proceed. Morrison made his decision. He would return to the basement that night, alone, and document everything he found. If he was going to expose what appeared to be systematic abuse within the royal family, he needed evidence that could not be disputed or suppressed. But first, he needed to ensure the safety of the young people he had seen in that basement room. Whatever else happened, Morrison could not allow them to continue being victimized while he gathered evidence. His duty as a human being superseded his duty to the crown. Morrison spent the day making careful preparations. He acquired a digital camera with night vision capabilities, a voice recorder, and a portable video camera, all from his personal equipment, to avoid any security logs that might alert others to his activities. He also researched the legal procedures for documenting potential crime scenes, wanting to ensure that any evidence he gathered would be admissible in court. As evening approached, Morrison reviewed the duty schedules to identify a time when he could access the East Wing without encountering other security personnel. He would have a 2-hour window between midnight and 2 a.m. when the area would be completely deserted. At 11:45 p.m., Morrison made his way back to the archive storage room. His hands were steady as he moved the filing cabinets aside once again, but his heart was racing with the knowledge that what he discovered in the next few hours would determine the course of the rest of his life. The basement door opened easily this time, and Morrison descended the stone staircase with his camera equipment in a small backpack. The corridor below was silent, but He could see light coming from the same room where he had made his discovery the previous night. As he approached the door, Morrison heard voices again, different voices this time, but including some of the same individuals he had recognized before. He set up his camera to record through the crack in the door, positioned his voice recorder to capture audio, and began documenting evidence of what would become one of the most explosive scandals in British royal history. What Morrison recorded over the next 90 minutes would eventually bring down 3 members of the royal family, expose a network of corruption that extended throughout the British establishment, and cost several people their lives. But that night, alone in the basement of Windsor Castle, Morrison was simply a man trying to do the right thing in an impossible situation. As he reviewed his footage later that night, Morrison knew there was no turning back. The evidence he had gathered was damning and irrefutable. The young people in that basement were clearly being abused, and members of the royal family were not just complicit, they were the perpetrators. Morrison's next decision would determine whether justice would be served or whether the most powerful institution in Britain would succeed in burying the truth forever. Captain James Morrison pulled his collar up against the November chill as he made his way through the east wing of Windsor Castle. The grandfather clock in the main hall had just chimed midnight, its deep tones echoing through corridors that had witnessed 800 years of royal history. Morrison had been making this same patrol route for 3 years, ever since his promotion to captain of the night security detail, and he knew every creak, every shadow, every sound that belonged in these ancient walls. At 42 years old, Morrison was a man who took his responsibilities seriously. His military background had taught him to notice details that others missed, and his 15 years protecting the royal family had honed his instincts to a razor's edge. Tonight felt different, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The usual sounds seemed muted, as if the castle itself was holding its breath. The East Wing was typically the quietest part of the castle during night hours. Most of the royal apartments were located in the private quarters on the opposite side, and this section housed mainly administrative offices, historical archives, and storage areas that saw little activity after dark. Morrison's team of 6 guards rotated through different sections of the castle throughout the night, but he always took the East Wing himself. It was the most isolated area, and if something were to happen, he wanted to be the one to handle it. As he turned the corner into the manuscript corridor, named for the priceless historical documents stored in climate-controlled rooms along its length, Morrison heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks. It was faint, almost impossible to distinguish from the general ambience of the old building, but his trained ear caught it immediately. A sound that didn't belong. He stood perfectly still, controlling his breathing to minimize any noise, and listened intently. For nearly a minute, there was nothing but the typical sounds of an old building at rest. Then, he heard it again, a low, muffled noise that seemed to come from below his feet. Morrison knew the layout of Windsor Castle better than most people who worked there. He knew that directly beneath this corridor lay a series of storage basements that hadn't been used in decades. The sound came again, clearer this time. Morrison's blood ran cold as he realized what he was hearing. It was a human voice, distressed, and barely audible through what must be thick stone floors. Someone was in the basement areas, and they were in distress. Morrison immediately activated his radio and called for backup. Within minutes, Sergeant Williams and Officer Chin arrived at his location. Both were experienced members of his team, men he trusted implicitly. Williams, a former Royal Marine, had been with Castle Security for 8 years. Chun, despite being the youngest member of their team at 28, had already proven himself during several security incidents. "What's the situation, Captain?" Williams asked, his voice low but alert. "Listen," Morrison replied, gesturing toward the floor. "Tell me what you hear." The 3 men stood in silence for several minutes. Just when Morrison began to wonder if he had imagined the sounds, they came again, more pronounced this time, almost like someone calling for help. "That's coming from the basement level," Chen whispered, his face pale in the dim corridor lighting. "But those areas have been sealed off for years. The access doors are all locked, and most people don't even know they exist." Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. In all his years at Windsor Castle, he had never heard of anyone accessing the old basement storage areas. According to the building schematics he had studied when he first took this position, those spaces had been sealed off in the 1970s due to structural concerns and had never been reopened. Who has access to those areas? Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Officially? No one, Williams replied. The keys were supposed to be destroyed when the areas were sealed. The only way down there would be through the original Victorian service entrances, and those are blocked off. The sounds from below became more frequent now, and Morrison could swear he heard what sounded like multiple voices. Whatever was happening down there, it involved more than one person, and the distress in the voices was unmistakable. We need to get down there, Morrison said, making the decision that would change everything. There are people in those basements, and they're in trouble. But, Captain, Chin protested, we don't have authorization to access sealed areas. Shouldn't we contact the palace administrator first? Morrison looked at his two subordinates, weighing his options. Protocol dictated that any unusual situation should be reported through proper channels. But the sounds from below were becoming more urgent, and Morrison's instincts told him that time was critical. In his years of military service, he had learned to trust those instincts. If someone is in distress in those basements, we have a duty to help them, Morrison said firmly. We can deal with the paperwork later. Right now, we need to find a way down there. The three men began a systematic search of the East Wing, looking for any access point to the basement levels. Morrison sent Chun to retrieve the building schematics from the security office while he and Williams examined every door, every grate, every possible entrance they could find. Chun returned 20 minutes later with a set of architectural drawings that dated back to the castle's major renovation in the 1990s. The documents showed the basement layout in detail, a complex maze of storage rooms, utility corridors, and what appeared to be older chambers that predated the Victorian era. Look at this, Chen said, pointing to a section of the drawings. There's a service entrance here, behind the archive storage room. According to these plans, it should connect to the main basement level. Morrison studied the schematics carefully. The entrance Chun had found was located in a storage area that was rarely accessed, hidden behind rows of filing cabinets containing historical documents. It would explain why the basement access had been forgotten. Over the years, storage had been piled in front of it, effectively concealing its existence from most of the castle staff. The three guards made their way to the archive storage room. The heavy wooden door was locked, but Morrison's master key opened it easily. Inside, they found exactly what the schematics had indicated: rows upon rows of metal filing cabinets and storage boxes, all covered with a thick layer of dust that suggested they hadn't been disturbed in years. "Help me move these," Morrison ordered, beginning to push aside the cabinets nearest to the rear wall. The furniture was heavier than expected, and it took all three men working together to clear enough space to reach the wall. Behind the storage units, they found what they were looking for: a narrow wooden door, painted the same color as the surrounding wall, and nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. The door was old, probably original to the Victorian renovation, with heavy iron hinges and a lock that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Morrison tried his master key first, but the lock was too old and corroded to open easily. Williams produced a small toolkit from his utility belt, a habit left over from his military days, and began working on the lock mechanism. "This is going to take a few minutes," Williams said, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. "The mechanism is seized up pretty badly." While Williams worked on the lock, Morrison and Chen listened carefully for more sounds from below. They were definitely there: muffled voices, what sounded like movement, and occasionally something that made Morrison's stomach turn, sounds that suggested someone was in genuine distress. "Got it," Williams announced quietly as the lock finally gave way with a rusty click. Morrison slowly pulled the door open. Beyond it lay a narrow stone staircase that disappeared into darkness below. The air that wafted up from the basement was stale and musty, with an underlying smell that Morrison couldn't identify, but that made him uneasy. "Chun, stay here and monitor our radio," Morrison ordered. "If you don't hear from us every 10 minutes, call for backup and contact Inspector Davies immediately." Chen nodded, though Morrison could see the young officer was disappointed not to be included in the investigation. "Understood, Captain." Morrison and Williams began their descent into the basement. The stone steps were worn smooth by age and slippery with moisture. Morrison used his tactical flashlight to illuminate the way, the beam cutting through darkness that seemed almost solid. The sounds they had heard from above were much clearer now, coming from somewhere deeper in the basement complex. The staircase ended at a long corridor lined with wooden doors. Most of them stood open, revealing empty storage rooms filled with nothing but cobwebs and the accumulated dust of decades. But, at the far end of the corridor, Morrison could see a faint light coming from beneath one of the doors. As they approached the lit doorway, the sounds became unmistakable. There were definitely people behind that door, and they were in distress. Morrison could hear what sounded like sobbing, muffled voices, and other sounds that made his training and instincts scream that something was very wrong. Morrison pressed his ear to the door and listened carefully. What he heard made his blood run cold. There were multiple voices, both male and female, and some of them sounded young, possibly teenage or even younger. The distress in those voices was genuine and immediate. Williams looked at Morrison with a question in his eyes. They both knew that whatever was behind that door was not something they were prepared for. But they also knew that their duty was clear. If people were in distress, they had to act. Morrison tried the door handle slowly and found it unlocked. He pushed it open just a crack, enough to peer inside without being seen. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life, and set in motion events that would shake the British royal family to its core. The room beyond was larger than the storage areas they had passed, with stone walls that looked much older than the Victorian renovation. It was lit by several battery-powered lanterns, creating a harsh, uneven light that threw strange shadows on the walls. In the center of the room, Morrison could see several figures, some sitting, some standing, all in various states of distress. But it was what else he saw in that room that made Morrison's hand freeze on his radio. Standing with their backs to the door were two figures he recognized immediately, despite seeing them from behind. Their presence in this forgotten basement, at this hour, with these people who were clearly in distress, was so impossible that Morrison's mind struggled to process it. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, Morrison began to understand that what he was witnessing was not just a rescue situation. It was something much more complex and much more dangerous than anything he had imagined possible within the walls of Windsor Castle. The implications of what he was seeing began to dawn on him, and he realized that opening that basement door might have just changed everything, not just for him and his team, but potentially for the entire royal family. Morrison pulled back from the door and looked at Williams, whose face had gone pale with the same realization. They were no longer just security guards responding to a disturbance. They had stumbled into something that could destroy lives and careers and shake the foundations of the monarchy itself. And they had to decide, in the next few seconds, what they were going to do about it in the heart of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal secrets lay buried beneath ancient stone. A single scream pierced the midnight air on November 15, 2019. What began as a routine security patrol would uncover one of the most shocking discoveries in modern royal history. Captain James Morrison, a decorated veteran with 15 years of service protecting the British royal family, had heard many sounds during his night shifts: the creaking of old timber, the whisper of wind through corridors, even the occasional cry of peacocks in the grounds. But the sound that froze his blood that November night was unlike anything in his experience. It was human. It was desperate, and it was coming from beneath the palace itself. What Morrison and his team discovered in the basement of the East Wing would challenge everything they thought they knew about the people they had sworn to protect. Behind a wall that hadn't been opened in decades, they found evidence of activities that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy and expose a web of secrets that powerful people had killed to keep hidden. This is the true story of how one man's duty to investigate a disturbing sound led to revelations that would forever change the British royal family and cost several people their lives. It's a story of courage, conspiracy, and the terrible price of uncovering truths that some believe should never see the light of day.